Do you guys experience like a wild relationship between like crying or sadness and your libido? Yeah. I guess just fucking get into it. Yeah, nice. All right, so we have Mr. Sexy Swede himself on the podcast, Chris Lövgren.
Yeah, so it's actually pronounced Christofer Lövgren. If you want to try that out.
That was my second guess. Yeah,
Christofer Lövgren.
Yeah, that's good, man. Yeah.
Do you go by Chris or Christopher? Because I know Christopher Hitchens had a thing about that, and so I'm like super sensitive to like not truncating people's names if they don't like it.
Yeah, so I mean, back home, as it were, nobody calls me Chris here, but people internationally usually do that. I don't really care, so whatever floats your boat.
Well, so good to have you on, man. We've been enjoying the Do Explain podcast for quite some time. I've learned a hell of a lot through your conversations, and I'm just like super stoked to get to talk to you. This is going to be fun.
And also learned a lot about your sound quality and stuff. Just mostly me banging my head against the table going, how does he sound so good? How the hell is he doing this?
Wow.
Like from episode number 1. It was very impressive.
I don't know if I would agree with that from the beginning. I mean, I had a real thing for a lot of bass to begin with. And so not only did I try to make my voice sound darker, by speaking deeper, but also I don't know why. I just saw some YouTube tutorial where you kind of boost up the bass and the treble, and I just wanted to do the least possible. I think it sounds better now, but that's nice to hear.
So we should say you host the Do Explain podcast. How long has it been going now? Just over a year?
Yeah, so I think it's 2 years coming up in October. So it's been a while now, yeah. Wow,
congrats, man. Yeah, that's big. And so, yeah, it's a philosophy podcast, and it seems like you sort of explore the ideas of Karl Popper and David Deutsch, but it seems mostly focused on David Deutsch's philosophy, especially as expounded in like the beginning of Infinity. Was that the motivation? Like, did you read this book and go, holy shit, there's a lot of nice ideas in here. I want to start a podcast around like discussing them and things? Like, what was the original motivation?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So before I do that, though, I just want to return the ball on what Vaden said in the beginning there. I love your guys' podcast, too. And I have, too, learned a lot. So I'm very honored to be talking to you guys live here. It's super fun. Yeah, so essentially, I, like many of my guests have told me, I found David Deutsch on Sam Harris's podcast. Yeah, I've been a huge Sam Harris fan. And before that, I was a mega fan of Alan Watts. And I kind of had this tendency, and I've had my whole life, to trust authority or to delegate my thinking to other authorities. And there's a lot there that we can go into later with the emotional processing stuff. But so essentially, I found David there. I loved his line. You made 3 arguments there, and all of them were wrong. And I thought that was so badass. And I believed him. That was the thing, because I had up until that point thought that Sam Harris has all the answers. He has thought everything through. Nobody has shit on Sam Harris, right? So that was very intriguing. I went to Beginning of Infinity. Actually didn't like the book the first time around. A lot of it went over my head. I don't like physics much at all, so that kind of turned me off a bit. And but then I don't remember how, but I listened to I think I listened to the episode with Sam Harris again. There was something intriguing there, and I went back to the book a little bit later, and then I really got excited about it. And the podcast was essentially just my way of trying to understand the ideas. So I think if you listen to the first episodes, I didn't have a good grasp of it at all. And so I just tried to find these people on Twitter. I'd been battling with David and Brett Hall and others on Twitter, harassing them with questions. And they were nice enough to answer. And so the podcast was kind of an excuse to reach out to people that I thought was interesting that could help me clarify these things. And so it essentially started like that. And now I just see it as a podcast where I explore what I think is interesting with the worldview and epistemology of David Deutsch in the background there, more than being solely about that at this point.
How has your thinking evolved? Like the opinions you had about Beginning of Infinity and David Deutsch, say at the beginning of the podcast, compared to how you think about those subjects now?
I haven't evolved at all. I've devolved since I started, probably. No, so I think from the beginning it was mainly noticing that there was something there, but I didn't really understand. I didn't have the knowledge created for myself about what he was actually talking about. And so at that point, it was merely a matter of what's it called? Delegating to David's authority, which is the opposite of what he wants us to learn from his books. And but so I would hear something and I would know that I'd heard David disagree with that, but I couldn't put that into words myself. And I would be like, okay, yeah, but that can't be true. Okay, why? Well, David tweeted this, and and so now what's happened recently is that I feel like I've actually created the knowledge for myself. I had the ideas, and David he's no longer in the picture, which he shouldn't have been from the beginning. But so the main thing that his ideas helped me do was to shake the whole authority thing and actually learn to think and speak for yourself, which is extremely liberating psychologically, I think. And so I guess that would be the main thing. If you're looking for what I disagree with now, perhaps, with the worldview, I'm not sure if I have found that many explicit mistakes. I know from chatting with David personally that we have some smaller disagreements, I think, on, for instance, the usage of psychedelics, how useful they can be, or if they can have a special place in psychology, for instance. But yeah, so not much has changed there, more than that I actually understand why the ideas are great.
So, Vaden and I have spent a lot of time talking about like EA and EA community, and that's definitely people I think would identify as like being in that community.
Right.
Is that the same, would you say, of like the, critical rationalist / Deutschian community, or sort of those people that are drawn to Deutsch's work? Like, is there sort of a unified front at all?
Yeah, honestly, I feel like I'm kind of the wrong person to ask, because I don't engage much with Twitter. I hate like Discord chat groups and stuff like that. People have invited me to different forums for these things. And so I wouldn't want to see myself as part of a community more than, I share the affinity for these ideas. And I know I have a lot of people like Brett Hall and Luli who I love to follow and retweet their stuff. I get the feeling that there is a fairly strong community there for sure. Yeah. So I haven't read a single Karl Popper book from beginning to end. And
all right,
I would.
We're calling it. nice having you on. And,
he's no authority anymore. Yeah. No, but because I felt like I've gotten the meat of the epistemology from David Deutsch. I did write an essay on Popper and superintelligence, kind of. So I have read some of his stuff, but what I'm trying to say is I don't identify strongly with being a critical rationalist, for instance, or a Deutschian, as some people say, myself included. Maybe I can be described in those terms, but I see it more as kind of like being described as a Everettian or Newtonian. Like it's just, I just think this is how the world works in terms of epistemology. I don't need to identify more with that than that. You know what I mean? So,
I've been thinking about this idea of community quite a lot, actually. And I've been observing just what's happening in the EA space and seeing it kind of become very detached from the real world. And I guess I'm noticing a little bit of that too in the Deutschian space. And that I find to be a little concerning, frankly, particularly with like the concept of like universal explainers and all that. Let me try to concretize it a bit to turn it into more of a question. What is your opinion of free will? Because obviously you're familiar with Sam's arguments. And why do you think the concepts from David Deutsch can give us some insight into this question?
Yeah, so that's funny because I actually think that you didn't push the epistemological point enough.
Oh, great.
Free will.
Great.
Because I heard your discussion. It was a while back now, so I don't remember all the points, but between you and Sam Kuipers.
Yeah.
First of all, we have to just be careful with the usual points. Like nobody thinks that there's something spooky outside of the laws of physics. The free will we're talking about here is still compatible with determinism, all the normal caveats. And I think the mistake. I'm fine with Sam Harris's point that, as far as I understand it, if you watch your subjective experience, this is what Sam says is his personal contribution to this whole debate. Because you can talk about determinism and how it's all neurons in the void or atoms in the void, and there's no room for free will there. But his point seems to be that, okay, if you actually look closely at your subjective experience, you'll notice that there's no free will there either. Thoughts just pop up into consciousness, and you don't know where they come from. So in what sense are you choosing anything? And I can agree with that too. I just think that he's missing the epistemological point of how he's using self and how he's using free will here. He seems to think that free will, when people say free will, and please correct me here if you think I'm wrong about that, but he says that, that I could have done otherwise, that I consciously have some kind of ultimate veto power where I can choose stuff. Is that how you read him too?
Yeah, I think that's totally accurate. Yeah.
Yeah, and he also seems to talk about self as just what we're consciously aware of, maybe the conscious self-representation. And I just think that that's a very narrow way to define you. I think if we get into emotional stuff later, I think a problem that people often get into is over-identifying with, the conscious tension behind your face and the ideas that are expressed in words, and kind of neglecting all the other stuff, which is probably most of who you are, I would say. And so that's one issue I have with it. And then the other issue is, it's just a point of, why do we have the concept of free will to begin with? In this worldview, this epistemological, from that framework, we create different concepts to solve certain problems. And so when we have an entity in an explanation as free will, I mean, that solves a problem. That's something that we invoke to solve a problem. So it has a purpose there. And it seems to me that what Sam Harris is doing when he's saying that, okay, it just pops up into your consciousness and you didn't choose it, and you're influenced by your surroundings and your genes. You didn't choose any of these. You didn't choose your interests. I don't see what his alternative is if he wants to explain differences in voluntary behavior between people. It seems like he's saying, instead of saying, okay, Vaden chose to come to the interview without a shirt on today because he has free will and he thinks that's really cool and he wants to show up his pecs and all that. That's a better explanation to me than just saying, I don't even know what the alternative would be. Like, it just happened because of determinism or his genes or...
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah, it's just a matter of what's the purpose of the concept. And as we know from preparing epistemology, if we don't have a better explanation, you can't just refute something and then leave a big gap there. That's not how knowledge growth works. We have to have something else to jump to. So even if he says, well, you don't consciously choose your thoughts, I still consider it a better explanation to say that Vaden, you as the creative entity, you are making these choices. You are creating these thoughts. They're emanating from you. That's just a better explanation to me than all these environmental and genetic neuroreductionist explanations.
Okay, great. So couple of things I wanted to pick up on. Maybe I'll try to go in reverse order. So you had kind of ended by saying it's a bad explanation. And then you also talked about how free will is a concept that we invoke to explain stuff. So
yeah.
First, I don't think that free will is a concept we invoke. I think it's something we all feel innately. I think it's kind of the default state. So someone who has never listened to Sam Harris or David Deutsch or anybody, I think, comes with the idea that they can make choices. So I don't think it's necessarily something we invoke. I think it's something that we assume uncritically, first of all. Second, on the point of it being a bad explanation, well, it depends on what's being asked to be explained, right? For example, if we talk about depression, let's just focus on depression. Mm-hmm. An alternative explanation to the one that says people are depressed because they choose to be depressed invokes evolutionary psychology in the sense that we are evolved and there's certain traits which come along for the ride sometimes, which can express themselves negatively if overexpressed. And there's also neurochemical explanations. And I don't see determinism as being really an explanation at all. But I see it as something that all explanations have to be compatible with. So Determinism, I don't see it as an explanation, but I don't think that quantum mechanics is an explanation to depression either.
No.
This move that I've been seeing, like made by, I think, Sam Kuipers, and perhaps you in your comments, is that determinism is a bad explanation. Well,
yeah.
Everything is a bad.
4 differences in voluntary behavior between people.
Totally. And so I don't invoke determinism as an explanation for that either. But I do invoke determinism and say the lack of free will when I start thinking about certain kinds of mental health difficulties, the fact that I can't control my thoughts, then these observations that I can't control my thoughts.
But what do you mean by that? That you can't control your thoughts? Because they're not random either.
They're not random. So I know that Brett Hall likes to talk about our ability to like solve problems, right? And so let's just say you're working on a really difficult problem, a math puzzle or a Sudoku or something, and the solutions is not coming to you. It's just not coming to you. And then all of a sudden, boom, it comes to you, right? That feeling, I think, is familiar to many people who work on problems all day. They don't get it. And then all of a sudden the lights come on and you understand. You don't choose when that happens. That just happens to you.
Sure.
If you could choose that, then we wouldn't be struggling with the problem, right? And you can read accounts of, say, like Andrew Wiles and stuff. And he just talks about how like he was struggling. And then all of a sudden, like it all clicked into place. And that happened to him. And that clicking into place feeling is exactly what you notice when you're meditating and thoughts just arise. And so I don't think you can control this. And if we could, then we would just solve Sudoku puzzles like robots.
Yeah.
You know?
But that's the thing. Language is somewhat confusing here. And here I think Sam would agree, where you are nothing separate from the slew of ideas and their interaction. Like there's no you surfing on the stream making these choices. In that sense, I agree with Sam. But I don't know. It seems like both you and Sam have a very strict constraints on what we can call free and what that would mean. So what happens if Sam Harris is right? What are the implications for? Because to me, choices can't exist if we don't have free will. I mean, I'm fine to remove the free if we want to call it will, but it's still, we're using the person as the vantage point, and we're saying that the person is choosing things. And there is a clear difference in my mind between completely involuntary behavior and behavior that we deem to be voluntary. Mm-hmm. And so like a reflex is different from me choosing to do something consciously. And so I'm just not sure. I'm still set on the whole thing that you keeping free will as a concept is more useful to us in explaining things than removing it. And because what is the alternative there? I'm not sure that I got.
But it's so funny because when you say that, it's like if I tell you somebody jumps off a bridge, and then you say, "Oh, of course they did because they have free will." That seems to me to be a non-explanation, right? Compared to something like, "Of course they did because their wife just left them, their job has disappeared, they have a history of suffering from mental disabilities, yada yada." But to just say free will is to not provide any information into the question at all. So I see it as like you've heard the concept of like the God of the gaps, where people invoke God when they can't explain, say, earthquakes and volcanoes.
Right.
I see it's like the free will of the gaps. People can always just say free will to explain something they don't understand.
Yeah, no, so I would completely agree with you there. And I would use the same arguing against using determinism there and say that all those things you invoked, I still think points towards the specific ideas that the person had because of, of course, like this is, I guess, where my problem lies too. I don't deny that we're influenced. We live in this world. I'm in a certain environment, and this is actually maybe a nice segue over to evolutionary psychology later, because the way I view the body and genes is just another thing in our environment. It's just that we can't get out of that environment as it stands now. But so environment, of course, that influences us, and I don't know why why not being able to ultimately, for instance, the idea of you don't choose your interests. So the whole idea of what movies you prefer, and like if his classic movie example, and movies pop up, and you couldn't choose other movies. Yeah, of course, you have the knowledge you have at any time X, but it's the important part here when it comes to choices is that people can always create new choices, and it's better to call them free choices because we can differentiate between when someone's being coerced or doing something that is purely a mechanical fault of the brain, for instance, where your arm starts flailing. I just see that as much more useful, and I don't know why the other discussion is that interesting. Like, yeah, I don't know. He seems to think they have moral implications, but I'm not. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, the moral implications are immediate and profound, in the sense that, like, once I shed myself of this idea that people have free will, what flooded in was compassion. Compassion not only for the historical despots that you're never going to meet, but compassion for the asshole at the end of the bar who's just being a dick. Like, rather than
I'm sorry about that.
Rather than thinking they're being a dick because they choose to act this way, I see them as someone who grew up in an environment where this kind of behavior was rewarded. Perhaps they have all sorts of things going on behind the surface which are causing them to act in a particular way. And so the practical, immediate implications are just that you start to see other people with a deeper understanding of things that you previously would have just blamed them for. So
also yourself as well, not just other people.
Yeah. And so, like, on the influence to the by the environment thing, like, whenever people invoke free will, this is like severing any kind of possibility of explanation by recourse to the environment, because now the explanation is they freely chose to do it. Well, that is a
not free of other influences. I mean, it just means that you can make choices with all the influences and information and knowledge that you have. It's just that you're not determined solely by those restraints. I mean, the fact that I can't go outside now and fly by flapping my arms because of the laws of physics, I don't feel like I'm any less free to do things because of that. It's just a restraint. And I feel like that's the same with everything.
This maybe gets to your other point about how there's a big difference between, say, involuntary muscle spasms and voluntary choices, like deciding to go to the beach this afternoon, right? Like, I agree. And the way that I kind of think about it is through, like, basic computer programming. So one of, like, the first things you learn when you're in, like, computer science is how to program if statements. So if this happens, then do this other thing. And this is the way that we give computers the ability to choose. So there's nothing spooky about choices. We can program choices into Roombas and into chess bots, right? Where if this environmental condition is met, then do these kinds of actions. And then when the program gets sufficiently complicated, then we start just using anthropomorphic language, like it chose to move the queen to this spot because we don't understand all of the inner workings of the program. Similarly, this is how I view human beings. We are a super complex program, which could be written as a giant sequence of crazy if-then statements. And in this way, we have the ability to choose in the same way that a Roomba can choose to go left or right. But the choices that we make are always constrained by our programming. They're constrained by the repertoire of choices which we have available to us at every given moment. And understanding this is liberating because I can talk sensibly about the difference between voluntary and involuntary actions, and I can use the language of choice. But then when I have to zoom in and really focus on, like, what I mean by that, when I want to, say, explain certain, like, negative thought patterns and stuff, then I can stop using the language of choice because I know that ultimately we have the same ability to choose in the way that, like, a Roomba does. And that's not constraining. That's just an understanding of how these kinds of systems work. And I can switch between thinking about it from a higher level of abstraction when that serves me. And then I can go down to the lower level of abstraction, talking about determinism and stuff when that serves me. But talking about free will as if we just have it, I think actually is an impediment to understanding how the human brain works.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's always interesting to hear how people who have thought about a topic a lot, how they think differently from you on the topic. But so how, because I'm not sure I would agree with you on there being no fundamental difference between, the Roomba and the human there. So you don't think that the knowledge creating aspect there of being able to create something that wasn't pre-programmed is essential here at all?
Well, so isn't this the whole universal computation thing, right? That we are all fundamentally bound by the Turing's rules of computation. So in that sense, we are similar to a Roomba. I mean,
there are two types of universality that I think get mixed up. So universality of computation, that's just the baseline to be able to create knowledge. And then you need the explanatory universality that we have in our creator program, which is something different. So, I mean, you can be computationally universal without being able to be explanatorily universal.
Totally. So there are absolutely differences between the program of a Roomba and the program of a person. No doubt. But all Turing machines are deterministic. And that seems to be a point that is not emphasized nearly enough in the beginning of Infinity or Fabric of Reality, that as soon as you say the word computation, you're talking about a deterministic system, because you just have a tape that reads symbols and moves in accordance with the symbols, right?
Yep.
And so your question about, is epistemology relevant? Well, it's definitely relevant when we're talking about the difference between people and Roombas, but I don't think it's relevant when we're talking about whether human beings do or do not have free will. I think that we're just starting to conflate the categories there.
Yeah, no, so I guess the last thing I would say on that, because I'm not sure, maybe we have some differing intuitions there too, but I mean, I agree with most of what you say. I just think that determinism, the way I see it now, I think it might have been Brett Hall who said that to me. It's just a way of saying what is possible within the laws of physics. And if you believe the parallel universes theory as well, then all of them happens. Right. So it's not a matter of saying that everything started from point A and then everything just moves forward in time like clockwork. Determinism is just saying, what choices are possible.
Totally.
And then free will, he would say, is useful to keep in there to explain why people do certain things. But
if I can just interrupt just ever so slightly on that point, because that's another, I think, meme which is unhelpful. So often the debate is framed as if it's the free will people on one side and the determinist people on the other side. But I don't view myself as a determinist in the sense of thinking about determinism all the time as an explanation for stuff, which is, I think, I don't want to say straw man, but perhaps the slight misunderstanding of the other camp, because it isn't as if, quote, determinists are running around everywhere saying determinism is the explanation for things. In the same way that atheists aren't running around saying that atheism is an explanation for things. They're just saying that this one concept, God or free will, doesn't actually make much sense. So to attack the concept of free will is not to start invoking determinism as an explanation for everything, as I think Brett Hall and Sam Kuipers tend to imply, that like determinism is a non-explanation. Well, I agree. It isn't an explanation. It's not something I tend to invoke, except when trying to get rid of the unhelpful concept of free will. It's more that I see the concept of free will as an impediment to understanding things, because we can always say the reason somebody did something is because they freely chose to do it. Well, fine. That's almost the information content of a tautology. It's just, it's nothing, right? I don't say the reason people chose to do stuff is because of determinism. I have to think about what they did and then try to explain what they did using all the information I have available about the particular situation. But I would never invoke determinism as an explanation for anything. And I don't actually know any determinist who would. So I just want to clear that up, because I think that that's a bit of a misconception which is circulated.
Right. But would you be sympathetic to some of the people in that camp, like maybe, because I would say Sam Harris and maybe Robert Sapolsky, who's another strong proponent for the against free will perspective. To me, they do seem to exclude the fact that there's something going on, like there's something between the input and the output. They seem to be saying that this can all be explained by look at all these outside factors and all these, how the neurons are firing, the hormones, and they seem to neglect the information and the top-down influence there. I think that's the main thing I have an issue with.
Well, Sapolsky is a great example because his book Behave is an excellent attempt to explain human behavior. And he doesn't just fill the pages with people did this because of determinism, right? He goes from what we know about the instance before, I think the example he uses is like killing Hitler or something, to like 100,000 years before, and he's bringing all this information into bear to try to explain the decision that somebody made. So it's a perfect example of a smart author not invoking determinism. He doesn't talk about the stuff that David Deutsch talks about. And that's great. He's in a different area of research, and so he thinks about the world differently than David Deutsch does. And their books complement each other quite nicely, I think. But I don't see him neglecting stuff. I see him as just focusing on the phenomenon from a different scientific background.
Okay, I mean, I've only read through it kind of shallowly, and I haven't read. It's a long book, but I really like Robert Sapolsky. Actually, I think he's a very captivating speaker, and he's funny as hell too.
And that beard,
but
goddamn beard, is
so and the beard.
One thing to note, sort of just to use the language of Deutsch and explanations and everything, So Sapolsky will examine things like poverty, depression, and like the relationships thereof, and aggression, relationships between aggression, testosterone, etc. And he can use neurophysiology, biology, to start explaining why, for example, criminals will often have, or like people sentenced to like violent crimes will have higher levels of certain hormones running active in their body at the time of the attack and stuff, right? So he can look at statistical patterns of behavior in society and start exploring them with, various arguments coming from biology. And so this is now an explanation for like why certain people, given that they grew up in certain situations and stuff, might be more likely to commit some crime or steal something or be at risk of depression, right, or suicide or something like this. And so he's offering an explanation. And I don't see Deutsch or sort of Deutschian style reasoning offering a good counter explanation, right? So Sapolsky is able to account for like a lot of this kinds of behavior and under what circumstances it occurs, etc. But there's no sort of counter explanation there. So I would say, Popperians and Deutschians love to talk about, you have one explanation, you gotta criticize it and try and generate a better explanation that accounts for the same things or is tighter and explains more, etc. And just saying that people are like creative and can do anything they want because they're universal explainers. And obviously that's a bit of a straw man, right? But sometimes
that was going to be my counter.
But sometimes it's actually, sometimes it's not a straw man. Like I have seen basically those exact statements on Twitter many times, right? Like we don't need to pay attention to social sciences, etc. But anyway, what I'm trying to get at is like Sapolsky is offering, he's explaining phenomena that we see, right? And so now you have to try and come up with like a better explanation than that. And
at least address the content of his and Sam Harris's case. Like that's the one thing that I see also happening in the conversation is people go from Sam Harris to David Deutsch and then think that they don't have to address the case that Sam Harris made. Well, you do. If you want to say something about how we have free will, that's amazing. We can talk in terms of epistemology, but part of doing your due diligence is also addressing all of the strong arguments that were made by Sam Harris and Robert Sapolsky, which I see to be just ignored by people who go from Sam to Deutsch and then all of a sudden think we get free will out of some program that we don't understand.
There's nothing in Deutschian epistemology that would help you explain why certain people are more likely to be depressed than other people, or more susceptible to like PTSD after coming home from war, etc. Right? Whereas like
but I think there. But because it sounds to me, as far as I understand it, I mean, it's not my hobby horse by any stretch, but it's like, it sounds like the reductionist argument. that the only thing that Deutsch is turning against here is that, you know, the famous, I think I heard him say sometime that if we're going to explain why someone walked on the moon, we have to invoke different ideas. That has to be the level of explanation, not why the neurochemistry expressed itself in a certain way or why the atoms moved a certain way. That we can predict in that way, but we cannot explain. And so I also think the idea of top-down causality, in the sense that now, like I said, I don't know what studies or what Robert Sapolsky is claiming exactly there, but if you say that all these people who commit this certain behavior has raised levels of cortisol, that's or testosterone or whatever. I mean, that's a correlation. That's not causation. We know that. So, I mean, I think often it's neglected from that side that what I say now in terms of what the meaning is of the words and the sound waves that I'm making, I would say what affects you and your behavior now is not, it has to express itself at the physical level. Your brains are reacting, but the difference between if I'm saying this or if I'm saying really mean things about you guys, it's the information contained within there. It's the abstract thing that has the causality here. In terms of explanation, in terms of prediction, it's always going to be bottom up. But I think it's often neglected that the information is the salient part when we're talking about describing people's behaviors. And then, of course, I would say the physiology can influence and create sensations. And maybe it's much harder if you have 10 times the testosterone. Maybe that's much harder to refrain from cheating or things like that. But I think ultimately, since people can forego that behavior, even when they have more testosterone, the salience is still, in terms of explanation, at the higher level of the ideas. But yeah, I don't know if we're going to get any further on that.
Yeah, maybe one last little comment just to recognize the listeners to a particular video, and then we should pivot. But so Robert Sapolsky has an amazing lecture on depression on YouTube, which I recommend everybody listen to because it's just a stunning lecture. And what he says is that if you only think about depression at the level of neuropharmacology and neurotransmitters, you're going to be missing at least half of the story. Like, you can't just look at it in terms of drugs. You have to also look at it holistically. He recognizes that you have to zoom out and look at the level of ideas as well. You have to see, is this person's life fulfilling? Is their relationship satisfying? Are they working at a job that they enjoy? And this is the level of ideas. This is the very much non-reductionist. And so I completely agree with you. And I think that there's a bit of a trap when people talk about free will, because I think that the opposite is to be reductionist and look only at the level of like atoms in the void, when that's not the case at all. You can very much do away with the notion of free will and also keep the notion of ideas and memes. And like, this is sorry, I said one last thing, but I want to say one more last thing. When I think about how we don't have free will, I often think in terms of Deutsch, because he talks about mimetic transfer, right? He talks about how ideas have causal influence over human beings. So he talks about it's not that a human chose to tell a joke, it's that the joke caused itself to be told, right? If we just invoked the spread of ideas by talking about humans' free choice, then we don't have any traction into understanding how certain ideas spread. But if we instead move the locus of causality away from the human being, and we say, it's not that humans freely chose to tell a joke, but it's that the joke caused human beings to tell it. Knowledge causes itself to be instantiated and stay that way. What we're doing is we are taking a piece of human behavior, which used to be explained via free will, and explaining it in a more interesting and fundamental way. And this is just yet another example of how once you get rid of this concept of free will, you can start to make traction on all sorts of interesting problems. And the very notion of memes and the notion of knowledge having causal influence is to get rid of the free will of the gaps there. And so it's just interesting that Deutsch and some of his fans think that his work gives us free will, when I think that his work requires us to get rid of the notion of free will.
Yeah, I mean, I think he would, and I can't speak for him, but I think he would say that it's mainly a matter of in static societies where there are anti-rational memes that can be more causal in that sense, in a deterministic sense, and that I think that he has written explicitly about how certain people take the creativity and the person out of the whole picture and say that memes just are the controlling factor instead of the genes, and it's just as deterministic. So I'm not sure that he would agree with that, but I guess I would end on saying that, yeah, you know what? It's your guys' podcast. I love you both, and fuck free will. You got me. We can name the episode that. I'm good with that, man.
You've entered the lion's den where Ben and I perfectly agree, which is super unfair because we should find a subject that Ben and I disagree about.
No, I'm fine with that. No, that's fun, man.
Something I do want to bring up that I've been trying to infer from the podcast. What are your politics? Like, you hide your cards decently well. I know you've had some libertarian leaning folks onto the podcast, but you sort of did a good job of just questioning them and letting them expound on their ideas. And I haven't heard you endorse either various political policies or parties or where would you say you land on the political spectrum?
I mean, I'm super right wing, so I'm close to Nazi town there. Cut that out and have that as the intro, right? The first part of the podcast before the music.
Yeah.
No, but so I'm what I think Vade, and I think you coined the term apolitically blissful or something like that.
Blissfully apolitical.
Blissfully apolitical. I heard that and I thought, yeah, man, that's. I don't care much. I don't have a strong opinion there. I think that I'm leaning towards the idea that once again, epistemologically, I think I see the problems with having a central authority. I mean, if you draw the parallel to justificationism, how knowledge can't work like that. Mm-hmm. So I'm sympathetic towards the Popperian. The system isn't about who should rule. It's about how to remove and correct bad policies and leaders without violence.
Right.
But more than that, honestly, I couldn't care less about specific policy. And I just stay out of that it's completely.
It's something I've noticed over the last 18 months, because I used to follow the daily news cycle much more closely than I have over just during COVID times. And it's so nice because now I'm spending my time studying things that have permanence, that aren't going to just disappear in the next 2 weeks. Because I used to be so up to date with what Kamala Harris said and who's running in the primaries. And it's right. Who the fuck cares about any of that anymore? It's all gone. And so it's one of the nice things I find about studying philosophy and history, because the work you put in, you get to keep it for the rest of your life, right? And so I'm a big fan of just stepping back from the political news cycle and just starting to learn about other things, because how much of that stuff do you actually hold on to in 3 weeks? It's all just disappears. So I'm very much sympathetic to what you just said. And that's part of the blissful apolitical nature, which I'm becoming more and more of a fan of.
How often do you consume the news?
So I consume it socially. So typically my signal is if I'm out and 2 or 3 people all reference the same thing, then it's a story which is in the culture enough that I should be aware of it. So it's similar with pop culture. I tend not to say study Beyonce, but I'm going to pay close attention when people talk about her at bars and things, because these are the ideas that are in currency.
Right.
And so I let the world tell me what I need to focus on based on what people are talking about.
That's good. I think I heard Tim Ferriss make that point a while back, where he said several years ago, he said something like, if it's important enough, you'll hear it from your friends.
Yeah.
So he just said he had a zero news diet and he would get all the information secondhand like that. And I think I took that to heart. So that's brilliant.
It's trusting the meme complex, right? Whatever people talk about, especially if you hear the same thing from 2 people in your life who are in very different social circles. So if people in far away social circles tell you the same thing, pop culture, news, whatever, then I take that, like, especially at podcast recommendations too. If I hear like two people recommend a new podcast, I'm like, oh, okay, I need to know what that is. And that's been my strategy. And it works decently well because like there's just so much news that you don't care about, and it just like works you up, and then it's just fucking gone in the next news cycle. And it's like, why did I just get so invested into this? You know?
Yeah, and people get so fucking invested identity wise into it too, and you can ruin a family dinner or a family party or a new date. I had a friend recently actually who met a girl, and they got along great, and he was really into her, and then they got into politics one time, and then they never spoke again. So I mean, it's just so unnecessary, man.
So like, what do you think about critical rationalism as an identity?
I mean, it's bollocks, just like any other idea-driven identity like that where you cling too much.
I guess I kind of asked that because a year ago I would have said I was a critical rationalist. And that was before I met a bunch of critical rationalists. And and that's not an insult. Sorry, that sounded more of an insult than I meant. It's more just like as a silly little mental block. I just don't identify myself as, say, an EA or a CR or a LMNOP. And I do that just so that when there's a group of people all saying the same thing, I can use the fact that I don't identify as a means of starting to try to come up with ideas that are outside of that circle. Yeah.
I mean, I know I resonate with that because I don't know if it was on my podcast, but I had a discussion with Charlie Youngheim, who's a buddy of mine, about this very thing that I hate. I wouldn't call myself a critical rationalist. I don't see the point. Yeah, I don't know what it adds to the conversation too. It just seems like you just makes it's kind of similar to saying that, you know, I'm a vegan or I'm a leftist or whatever it is, that it sounds like clinging to me. And what I've come to the conclusion lately of why I resonated so strongly with the ideas from David Deutsch was, I just care about living a fun, nice, free of suffering life as much as possible. And even if it wasn't intended to be a psychological self-help book, I think that's mainly the role it's played for me, especially lately.
So you guys say, you don't like to associate yourself with labels, but I'm assuming you like to associate yourself with just communities of people. Like communities of people, of friends, is like one of the most important things in my life. And so that I think is like very important community in that sense. So do you guys just mean like a certain political label that sort of indicates like how you should be thinking about certain issues?
Do you have a label for your group of friends? Like,
yeah, fucking
I was just going to say the A team, or what do you call yourself?
Because I find it fairly easy to have communities and groups without having to label myself. And like, I guess Chris brought up veganism, and you do identify as a vegan.
Only roughly, because like I don't like I'll eat honey and like I'll eat like, you know, I'm only vegan to try and avoid the suffering. So if chickens are raised really well or something, I'd be okay with eating it. So there's lots of boundary cases where I'm fine. It's just as a shorthand when I'm talking to people, it's easier to be like, you know what this is, and I'm not going to spend 15 minutes telling you.
Yeah, of course.
That's a perfect way. Okay, that's a perfect way to explain the difference. So it's the difference between saying you're a vegan as just a quick way to communicate versus identifying as a vegan to the core of your being, right? Where you meet people at parties who declare themselves to be vegans and then spend the next
I'm Ben the vegan. Hello.
Yeah, the next like 100 minutes just talking at you and then just talking near you about veganism. And that's kind of the difference. It's like, I think you can use a label as a shorthand, but then I think if you couple that with a growing community who are all using the label, and then it starts to become a bit of a movement, and now people don't talk about being interested in effective altruism, but they talk about being EAs, right? That's like the common way to describe it. Then I think the label has started to switch from being a shorthand communication tool and started to become associated with like your entire being.
Nice.
And that's where I think it becomes a problem.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, when you're discussing ideas with someone, the way I usually visualize it is just that we're throwing out ideas into the arena of ideas, right? And then we're battling it out, shaping them together. And then we can take with us what we want from that. And hopefully we've both learn something from it, perhaps. But that's the danger when the ideas, you throw a bit of yourself in the ring and you're under attack. And it's adjacent to what you said there before about how criticism can suck. Yep. But I think it only sucks if it's either feels like a criticism of you as a person and your value, or if it's unwanted criticism. I think there's some concept of criticism scheduling that I'm not very familiar with, but the basic idea seemed to be that, criticism is great, but only when it's the right time for it. If I'm trying to write something, develop an idea, and then you come in and criticize it before I've asked for it, maybe I couldn't develop it fully in that direction. And because of your criticism, I now choose to go in your direction. And I would have gotten somewhere great if I just had let it develop a little more on my own before. It's not black and white, but I think identity it's never good to keep identity in the discussion of ideas. I don't think. Maybe that's too hard of a line, but
no, dude, it's such a nice insight because I hadn't associated the idea that let me float this past you guys. See if you what you think of this. That criticism sucks more and more as it becomes closer and closer to your identity. And so if I say to get to the grocery store, you have to turn right then left, and someone's like, oh, actually it's left then right. That's a criticism that doesn't matter really at all because that was just one idea that I got wrong. But if I'm criticized on, say, how I am a father or how I am a friend, then depending on the criticism, obviously sometimes you absolutely need to hear this, but it starts to hurt much, much more. And so if you take something like libertarianism, it is definitely a set of ideas, but at least in practice, all the libertarians I've met seem to identify as being a libertarian to the core of their very being.
Right.
And I don't know why that is the case, but I definitely have noticed that is the case. And so it's not as if you're just criticizing the ideas of libertarianism because of how deeply they've sunk into the hearts of those who hold these ideas. Now you're criticizing their entire personhood. And so I'm kind of taking your comment and maybe going a bit further with it than warranted, but there is something interesting about the suckiness of criticism increasing as you get closer and closer to your core identity, I guess.
I think there's also, I think, an additional layer though with the source of the criticism can matter a great deal, right? So if you have me criticizing a libertarian, it might not go so well if he or she is someone who identifies as a libertarian. But if their friend, who is also a libertarian, starts talking about we mostly agree about this stuff. We know we're both good people, but this one idea, I've been having some trouble with it recently. And here's kind of why I think it's wrong. I think it's easier to hear and receive that criticism than it is to hear it from me in that case, when we probably don't align much at all on those sort of political values. So the source of the idea probably shouldn't matter. But I think just subjectively, it does end up mattering. It's easier to hear criticism from close friends, from family, who you share a lot with, than just someone who.
Did you say it's easier from family and friends?
Yeah, I was going to say
because it can go the other way around, right? Because if my mom were to say, "Oh, I don't like your sweater," I don't give a shit about that. But if a hot girl that I've never met before says that, I'm crushed, dude. No, I'm not crushed. You know what I mean?
Well, it depends on the sweater too. If it's a pretty boss sweater.
It's part of my identity, man.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think didn't Joseph Agassi gave a talk for the Karl Popper Society, and I think someone asked him how do you think about giving criticism, or how do we solve the problem that ideas can really only be improved via criticism, but people in general do not handle criticism very well. And I think Agassi basically threw up his hands and said, this is a very difficult problem. And I do not know how to solve it. And there's just something, maybe it's a cultural issue, right? You have to generate an entire culture of criticism, and it's more and more okay for everyone's ideas to be criticized.
Two things I wanted to add to that. One is, do you two feel after coming across Popperian epistemology and getting acquainted with this tradition of criticism in a different way. Has that changed your relationship to criticism in a substantial way? Or do you feel like you're still, maybe it depends on the topic, as we said before, but do you see a big difference in practice for yourselves?
Yeah, so I certainly do. It's still hard to receive criticism in real time, but I think I'm like maybe better at digesting it. One interesting thing I've found that after like reading a lot of Popper and being influenced by those ideas and like letting them percolate and then eventually taking them on board was that I find I'm much more ready to like put idea, like especially in writing, like I'll write something and be much more ready to just like throw it out in public and just sort of let like so I didn't write anything publicly for like a long time, and then basically like last Christmas I just started writing like pieces and would like post things on the EA forum that like people might not like and stuff. And it was like psychologically easier for me to just say, okay, like I have this idea now. And if I have this idea, probably other people have similar ideas. And the best way, so either, you know, I write up an idea and I put it out there and I change people's minds, or I'm terribly wrong. And then I have my mind changed, and it won't be like a fun process, but it's now easier for me to just say like, if I hold like this strong opinion about something, I should probably put it out there, like for the good of the public conversation, right? Like as like to try and avoid sort of like preference falsification stuff where like some people think one thing, but no one actually wants to say it publicly. So anyway, it's been easier for me, I think, to take like slightly controversial takes or like have controversial opinions on things and then actually write it up and like let people see it than it was otherwise. Because I feel like slightly more distance from my ideas now, right? Like it's just like ideas I have and maybe they're right and maybe they're wrong. And the only way to figure it out really is to just like throw it out there and see what happens. So that's been one interesting side effect for me, I think, for sure.
It has completely changed the way I do research, for example. Like another thing that I think is underemphasized is just soft skills. So it sounds super flabby and kind of like qualitative and social sciencey, but I think that you can actually develop a bunch of soft skills which really will improve collaboration potential. Because to be criticized and to get criticism, you have to work with people and you have to work closely with people. And so subtle things like on Slack, telling jokes and just being like a easygoing guy. It's not as if I was just a stoic stick in the mud before I read Popper and then I changed, but it's more that I had these certain qualities of being like a jokey dude. And I realized that this is actually serving a role, and the role it's serving is hopefully allowing people to want to collaborate with you a bit more, and then get into kinds of discussions like Ben and I have on the podcast all the time, and form relationships. And then once you form a relationship that's built upon like mutual respect and mutual criticism, like Ben and I have a great relationship because the whole relationship is built on like trying to improve each other through mutual criticism. But I think part of that is enabled through soft skills, through being able to tell jokes in the middle of it, through being able to just like have a fucking laugh at yourself and at
don't take yourself
other.
So seriously. Yeah, exactly.
But so these are things that I was kind of doing by accident. And upon reading Popper, I was like, oh, actually there's a role for this. And the biologist P.B. Medawar, who is
you're just making up names at this point.
No. So Richard Dawkins fell into Karl Popper through P.B. Medawar. So he's a famous biologist who is a Popperian and made some fundamental insights into biology.
Isn't it Medawar? Or no?
M-E-D-A-W. I just Wikipedia'd it. Sir Peter Brian Medawar was a British biologist and writer who's worked on graph rejection and the discovery of that. Doesn't matter. But I bring him up because if you read about what people said about him, they said that he was just like the life of the party. He was a really social, affable guy who had a giant network of collaborators, and through this made some fundamental insights in biology. And I think about that because like criticism sucks. But if you're just like a super nice guy in between, then that's going to allow you to give and receive much more of it, you know? And these kinds of qualities, I think, are of huge practical import into actually trying to do like real research and produce real new knowledge, because this is the only way we can produce knowledge. You have to kind of set up your life such that it's a joy to be criticized and to receive criticism. And that, I think, comes through the careful application of a lot of these soft skills, which are often not included in the conversation.
So don't be an asshole is the takeaway.
Yeah, no, and it's just a nicer way to live.
Totally, man.
Because I wanted to say, let's see if I can structure it for myself. First of all, I want to compliment you two because I've thought repeatedly listening to you that you are exceptionally good at this, because both of you, you often say the same thing when someone has said something that maybe it's not the way you thought about it, and then you say interesting, and then you you keep arguing around it. So I can genuinely hear that you're living, you're walking the walk, not just talking the talk. So that's inspirational. But then the fact that if we go back to the idea of identifying, clinging to your ideas, that has tangible physiological effects, in the sense that, and I used to have this much more before, but if you get criticized about something you're sensitive about and you cling to that, and then it feels like you are physically under attack. Your body might produce the same fight-flight response, sympathetic nervous system response, as if you were actually in danger for your life. And I mean, that to me, firstly, is a great testament to how ideas are important in causing things, speaking about what we spoke about before. But also, I mean, we're all in a relationship, right? You're getting a kid soon, Vena, right? So are you married?
Just got married 2 weeks ago. Boom.
Oh, congratulations, man. Hell yeah.
Thanks.
That's great.
So I am married
Thanks
now.
for the invitation. Yeah. And Ben, you have a girlfriend too, right?
I do, yeah.
I mean, isn't that the perfect, I don't know how it is for you, but that's something I've struggled with so much when it comes to seeing the context and understanding what is the purpose of conversing here. Because I feel like oftentimes I have these conversations with people like you, and we think it's fun. I mean, on my own podcast, as long as it's in good faith. I don't like it when people are just want to be dicks, but in good faith, I love hearing the words, "Oh, I disagree with you," or "That can't be the case." Like, that's fun. That's exciting, right? We get to wrestle, and then I get to either I test my ideas and they hold up, and I'm like, okay, I've tried them, they're still good, or you show me something better, and I leave with better ideas. It's a win-win.
Yeah.
But when it comes to going out and conversing with my wife, oftentimes it's not about the semantic content and reaching the conclusions. It's more a matter of the vibe of feeling seen or heard. And I struggle sometimes with, but what she's saying now is not factually true, but what she's wanting from this conversation is to be emotionally validated. And so do I want to be right, or do I want to be happy? And I'm leaning more and more towards wanting to be happy.
Well, totally, man. Like,
it's a good skill to have, right?
Yeah, and something that I think about in those circumstances too is just how difficult communication is. And so very often I will just remember that the person I'm speaking to, and myself as well, we're both struggling to communicate the ideas that are inside our heads right now. And often people will say something, and if it is factually incorrect or whatever, that's not really the point, because the thing that they're saying is just it's an approximation of what's in their head. And, and especially with like conversations with your partner and stuff, because I don't know, Vaden, can you stop forgetting to do the dishes? Isn't actually about the dishes. It's more about me being a more present partner at home, say.
Yes.
And realizing that it's not about the dishes, it's about something deeper, but that deeper thing is actually like super hard to express. And so all you can do is express it through sometimes certain comments about the dishes and that kind of thing.
That's well put.
Yeah, that's one way that I've got around this, is it isn't as if like our partners aren't interested in facts and aren't interested in being rational. Of course they are. It's just that the thing that they're trying to express is much more of a feeling than, say, expressing something on Wikipedia. So the very thing that they're trying to express is a more difficult thing to communicate. And that's why we have to kind of try to seep through what is being said to try to see the underlying thing that's trying to be expressed, I guess. Yeah.
So trying to tally the number of times you've done the dishes that week is not the way to go.
That's the right approach, of course. Yeah.
Well, actually,
Yeah.
But I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I mean, I know these things and I'm fairly good at them, but I still get caught up sometimes, you know.
At the same time, though, there is a role for like trying to drill down a bit and clarify what's going on. So, right. So if your partner's like, I need you to do the dishes more, you might realize like, okay, there's something deeper at play here. There's just like, you know, maybe she's unsatisfied with like how busy I've been recently or something. But then you know, I think you want to try and bridge that gap somehow and say that. Otherwise, you're just kind of guessing what what the actual deeper issue is, like using the surface level clues. And that itself can like run into a lot of problems because, you know, maybe you were just supposed to do the fucking dishes. And then all of a sudden, you're taking a week off from work, and she's like,
isn't that the most condescending? That's like the most condescending thing when you are like, okay, baby, what is really wrong? And she's like, what the fuck are you saying? You're supposed to do the dishes. You know, can't it just be about what I'm saying?
But so what about you? What are some practical things that you got out of reading Deutsch, Popper, etc.?
Yes, I think I'm going to preface that by just saying that I feel like there are two kind of distinct ways of viewing the mind. And one is often espoused in like the meditation circles where they talk kind of about the monkey mind and how, you know, so much of your thoughts is just repetitive and random and you should just, you know, learn to detach from it, see it, and it won't affect you as much. And I think that evolutionary psychology might influence that view a bit, like how we're wired to always worry and look out for the bad stuff and stuff like that. And then I think there's the other view of mind, which I tend more towards, and I'm making a hard distinction here. I mean, I'm sure there are nuanced middle grounds here, but where the mind, where your thoughts make sense and your emotions make sense to the extent that, yeah, if you have a repetitive thing going on in your head all the time, that's not just how the mind is, quote unquote. There's something there that's not being addressed, and you can get rid of that. And so with that said, yeah, so I lean more towards that, and hence I think it's kind of can be useful to go back in your history, your biography, and look at seminal moments and how you grew up, and to try to understand yourself and certain parts of yourself to become a more healthy, happy human being. And so I'm sure there are ways to actually just look at like the thought patterns right now, like the CBT. This is how I'm thinking right now. Fuck the past, more or less. We just focus on thinking better now. But I think they're missing something. I think there's something to be said for going back. So I'm going to do that. And I'm going to say that the last 2 years, I've spent a lot of time doing exactly this, trying to understand myself, different parts of myself. And so the fundamental thing that I have discovered happened to me when I was younger was that my relationship with my father, and my father is great, and we've talked about all these things, and we're good now, but he had a very harsh way he was always right in his mind, and there was no room for other views or other people's emotions. So if you didn't think what he thought, you were wrong on any particular point. So both me and my brother, we learned early on, and this is the theory I have, that if you come to someone that you look up to, I mean, as a kid, you don't know much about the world, you don't know much about you get everything from other people, and you look up to your parents more than anyone else. So if your parents constantly instill in you that, okay, if I come with an idea and you shoot it down because it's not what you like, or if you say that, for instance, my dad loved sailing and he wanted me to be into sailing. I hated sailing. And so he would show me that wasn't a good thing, that I didn't like that, and I liked something else that was wrong. And so eventually you learn that you are wrong. And that's a horrible, horrible category error, but I think it's fairly common. And if it's rooted deeply enough, it can wreak a lot of havoc because then you stop trying. And so I've always looked to other people to tell me what to think, to tell me what to do. I remember being 16 years old or something like that, and going to get clothes for myself. My mom had bought most of my clothes most of my life, and I had to ask my classmates. I was like, I can you come and shop with me? I don't know what I like. I don't have any opinions. And the same with group projects in school. I remember in high school, I wanted someone else to tell me what to do and take charge. So I think that's why I cling on to Alan Watts, my first authority. Everything he said was right. And so if you were to ask me, what do you think of topic X? I would have to say, well, I haven't heard Alan Watts talk about that, so I don't know. Let me go and see what he says. And then I would change to Sam Harris. I would do the same thing. And then I would change to Deutsch, do the same mistake. But I think what really, really resonated with me in Deutsch's work, and I think this is something I've realized recently, is that he gave me the permission and showed me how that's a fundamental mistake. You have to think for yourself. Everyone is fallible. There is no authority. And I think that took me 2 years of the podcast almost, parallel with a lot of emotional work and stuff like that, to really hash that out. And now finally feel like I'm thinking for myself. And it's the most freeing thing I can imagine. So I think that's why I resonated so strongly with that perspective.
That was a fucking beautiful answer, man.
Dude, that blew our answers out of the water.
Great.
Profoundly.
Yeah, I have nothing to say except that was a gorgeous and so honest account. And like it was so insightful because the way that you explained it made a lot of pieces click into place, because it's like you learn to not trust your own mind, I guess, right? Because every idea you have is being told that it's wrong, and that it's not that we are all fallible; it's that you personally are fallible. Exactly. And especially when you're young and looking for guidance, and so like I did the same thing, and I still do the same thing of going from person to person and studying them, and I can even like remember the sequence of thinkers that I obsessed about. So I guess I'm saying that your and my intellectual history seems to be quite similar, because we both did this going from person to person. But I see it as something I'm going to continue to do, not something that I wish I didn't do. And I guess I heard in your comments that you kind of you framed it as if it was like a weakness, but I think it's not. I think it's like it's a strength, and it's a really powerful mode of self-improvement and of learning.
I think the part of it, because of course part of it for me was just fun and just being curious, and that's what I hear you describe here. So I think the only bad part about it was the authority, delegating my own thinking because of feeling like there was something wrong with my own ability to think. That I think is always a bad thing. And you can have the obsessing over a person purely from interest, I think. And then I don't see any issue with it at all. Let me put it like this. So if you've been in a big trauma, like you've been raped or abused, or your parents hit you or something like that, it's so easy to point a finger and say that was really damaging. That was awful. And I get why I would be messed up. But I think, and you don't at the same time, you don't want to get stuck in a victim mentality where you continually define yourself by your past and you can't move forward and things like that. But then I think there's the other end of the spectrum where people like myself who've had from the outside looking in, it looks like a really good childhood. It's fine. No major things there. My parents loved me. They wanted the best for me. But you can end up, you can be really unlucky in that you make bad interpretations, and maybe you have some genetic predispositions to be, I don't know, more stressed out, more susceptible to certain things. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very important it's harder then to maybe acknowledge that things have been really tough for you. And I think that's one of the most important things have been for me, to actually acknowledge that certain things really turned out badly for me. And it wasn't until I acknowledged that and actually went into that suffering that a lot of it started to loosen up. And I don't know about you two, I'd be curious to hear how, because it's one thing to think that you can't think, but it's also one thing to add to that it's bad to show emotions. And I think as men, maybe it's more common for us that we learn that. But that was also a thing that I got instilled in me early. And that shit sticks with you, man. We're very emotional creatures, especially when you're younger. A lot of things are emotionally overwhelming. And I'm very persuaded that the psychosomaticity, like the influence on the body, if you don't get to express emotion, that energy, that physiology something has to happen with that. And if you don't get to express it, it'll come back to bite you. And that's something I've noticed a lot. Been very, very surprised about how big of an influence that has been.
Yeah. So one brings us to talking about a couple of episodes of your podcast. Like, what's remarkable about your podcast is a lot of it is dedicated towards like rigorous philosophy and thinking through problems. But then you also have the side of it that's like dealing with emotionality and like working through issues and stuff. And you had a couple episodes in particular with Matt Goldenberg, I think. Where you sort of worked through a lot of these issues, like from your past in real time, like recorded it and just put it out there. And I gotta say, man, like that, especially that first one, I think the first half of your episode or the first episode with Matt, that hit me hard listening to that. Like it was very impressive. Like you cried a few times. And then of course, as a podcast host, you would have the power to remove that if you wanted to, but you didn't, right? Which just says something about like how sort of honest you wanted that portrayal to be. And so I'm just curious, one, about the decision to like make those kind of things a part of your podcast, and like why you chose to do that. And two, if being like that honest and that open, especially in those episodes, was difficult at all. Like, did that open up some vulnerabilities? Did you feel scared to do that? Like, I don't know if I could do that. Like, I'm typically pretty okay with crying. It's like you cry at the drop of a hat, but there was something like just incredibly brave about that. So anyway, I would encourage people to listen to those episodes. It's like quite something. One of the most unique podcast episodes I've ever heard in my life, by far. But two, I'm just wondering if you could talk about that experience.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for saying that. It's very kind words. And I know that I actually, I got notified about you, Ben, the first time when you retweeted this, I think, this episode and said something about it. That's how I found your guys' podcast. Okay, so it's essentially been my biggest interest the last years to do this for purely wanting to feel better reasons, because I have a lot of physical issues that I suspect are brought on by emotional issues to begin with. And so I've just been deeply into that, and I've seen such great results that I just felt like, I've resonated more and more with that. And I think, especially in circles that like to listen to podcasts such as ours, that can tend to be fairly heady and, like you said, stringent philosophy and arguing, and it's I kind of want to give, and it might sound a little grandiose perhaps, but I kind of want to lead the way a bit since I've been so repressed in my own emotion and seen how damaging that can be. And now I feel like I'm getting confident and comfortable in my own skin. And I've learned that all the parts of me are okay. And there's nothing wrong with me. I can be sad. I can be sensitive. And so I felt like I kind of want to instill that in other people as well by showing them that, okay, if this guy who, I don't know how I come across, but I would assume I come across as fairly well-spoken, confident. And if he can do that, if he can cry, maybe it's okay for me to cry. Sounds silly maybe, but I think it's so important. And so part of it was just wanting to use Matt selfishly, because I think Matt is a wizard and he's amazing at what he does. And so the podcast was a way for me to get a free consultation. And I truly want to feel better. So I wanted to just give it a wholehearted go there. And then I just felt, like I said, I just felt like, hey, what better way to show myself and my own brain as well that it's okay to cry, and to do it in a setting where the pressure is on. And I have all these thoughts about, are you going to come across as disingenuous? Are people going to judge you for this? And I just felt like it was the right decision. And I've gotten proof of that just by the comments you made here, Ben. It's been overwhelmingly positive feedback. And I'm really happy I did it. And I enjoyed doing it too.
I think it's so important because typically when people make when we make podcasts, when you present yourself to the public, you put on a face of strength. You put on a face of almost like all the human issues that the listener has. You don't have any of those, right? But we're all fucking human beings, and we can talk about heady philosophy stuff, but it's important to talk about like real stuff too, so that we don't give this impression that we're just like some robots from Mars only talking about philosophy all the time, because this is like, we're real people and we struggle with our shit. And like, I think that one of the things that's so freeing about Popperian epistemology is that you start to trust your own intuitions a bit more and know how to deal with them. And you deal with them by putting them out in the public sphere and having conversations about it. And once you realize you can do that about personal stuff too, and it's all the same. And then this, like, you just drop this face of having to perform, and it's just an honest conversation. Like we haven't met in person, but I feel like we're just buddies talking at a bar right now. And that's like an awesome feeling, because we're not trying to present to the world any particular way. We're just three human beings who are interested in some things and trying to talk through it. And like, I don't like this intellectual pretension, because I think it gives off the impression that other people somehow can't do this, that you have to be this like this stoic robot philosopher guy, when that's not the case at all. You just be like a human being talking about things you're interested in and encouraging others to do the same. So just a huge like I really respect what you just said and the whole project, man. It's super valuable, and I think the world needs much more of it. Like, we could just start crying right now if the three of you just want to have a little cry session. But but just huge props, man. Like, mad respect for that. That's really awesome.
Sure. I mean, you guys are the nicest guys ever. You're just showering with me with compliments. But no, I resonate strongly with that, and that's why I was so relieved to stop editing. Because that's exactly what I had been feeling before, that I'm still trying to to live up to this lack that I feel inside me, that I'm not worthy, that I'm not good enough. And I have to prove myself somehow. And that never ends, because it's a fundamental mistake. Like, there's no way to heal that except on the emotional level. And it's just about the fun of it, right? I think that's why we vibe so well, because fun and then being really interested in these intricate ideas and wrestling intellectually and stuff. That combo is just unbeatable. It's so great. And but okay, so let me turn it around on you a little bit. So we'll get to the crying session, but so how often do you cry? When was the last time you had a good cry, like a real cry? Baden, you can go first.
This is an easy one. This is unfair because I just got married 2 weeks ago.
That doesn't count.
Dude, I was crying like a baby up there. I didn't think I was gonna, but... Okay,
so you don't cry regularly?
No,
like,
so...
on a regular basis, no.
I cry in movies quite a bunch. The one movie that always fucking gets me is, and I can't actually watch it anymore, is the Goofy movie. Do you ever remember watching the Goofy movie?
Like the animated character Goofy?
Goofy is like a Looney Tune. Yeah. The animated character Goofy. Exactly. That guy. So there's like a scene in that movie where like him and his kid are fighting, and like Goofy's inside the car and his kid's inside the house, and he's like trying to open this can of like beans or whatever, and it's just, they're fighting, and I just go to tears in that scene.
Wow.
So I can't watch certain movies, but I wouldn't say that crying is a regular part of my routine. No.
Right. So how about you, Ben?
Actually, Vaden's wedding also gives me an out. I started crying during his best man speech because his best man was crying so much, and it was like the most adorable thing ever. So I started crying during that.
That's sweet.
I think everyone was crying. I don't think there was a dry in the place.
I was crying. I wasn't even hearing it.
Exactly, but I think the last, like movies and stuff, I often cry. Can't really go into the details, but just something happened to my girlfriend, something dated. sort of bad.
Yeah.
And so it's that hit me hard. So like probably in the last I think like sort of beginning of COVID-ish. That's the thing. That hit me really hard. But like Vaden, I would say I don't cry regularly. Like I don't. I can't just like sit down and cry.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone can do that, but I certainly can't do that. So it's got to be some external influence.
What about after the social media episodes?
When I had to change my password, or when Vaden dissuaded me from being EA, I was like, I've lost my identity. I can no longer.
I'm totally kidding. That was a cheap shot.
So to contrast that, I cried a lot. I've cried a lot these last 2 years. I wouldn't be surprised if I've clocked maybe a good 30 hours of pure crying, including like snot coming out of your nose, convulsing, sobbing.
This is in the past year?
Past 2 years, I would say. Okay, But so what and I'm not sure if I'm maybe a bit in the extreme, because I really learned that emotion was bad. And so I maybe stored more than most people. But I'm curious to hear what you think, because this is the thing. I don't have any good explanations here for how these things work, but I'm extremely, extremely curious. And what has shocked me the most during this period has been, because we think we know who we are and we know most about ourselves. And it's like, I don't have any repressed anger or repressed emotion. I don't know if repression is something that it's debated in psychology, but I don't know what else to call it. Things that I'm not aware about, but that's still there. But that's the definition of something being unconscious, that you have no idea it's there. Right. And so I've just again and again been so surprised by the physiological response where I can get, and the way I see it now, and I don't know if it makes any sense, but it's that somehow it can get stored in the body. Emotions can get stored and memories can get stored in a way where there are different models. I know one model, for instance, says that a way to suppress emotional expression is through bodily tension. So if you've learned culturally that a certain emotion, it's not okay to feel that emotion, one way to suppress that when it comes up is to tense a part of your body, and that will stop the emotion. But the tension will stay there. It has to be this. It's literally like a physical shield, shielding you off from that. And another theory, which is the theory I think is the best one for what anxiety is that anxiety is exactly this. Anxiety is something that kicks on as a suppressing core emotion that's trying to come up. So every time you feel anxious, you are feeling something else, sad, scared, but you don't want to feel that. And so this is coming in as a cork, trying to push it down. And as someone who has suffered from anxiety disorder, panic disorder for many, many years, quite severely actually, that's the only theory that has worked for me to get rid of anxiety. So I'm biased here, but I also think it makes sense. But so for instance, how would you describe what happens when I get a manual adjustment? Let's say I'm super tense in my hips, and then I do a certain breathing exercise and I massage them in a certain way. And all of a sudden I get, from nowhere, I'm not thinking about this before, I get a really strong emotional memory from when I was younger, and I get a strong emotion, and I can just start screaming or crying or laughing hysterically. It's just, there's something to the idea that it's stored. And I don't know how to explain it well, but I've had so many experiences that looks like witchcraft, literally. But the body keeps the score. There's a book that's called that, about trauma and stuff. And I very much believe that to be the case. What do you guys think?
So fascinating. I have so many thoughts. So first, I've been reading a bit of, I'm going to blank on the name.
Marie Kondo.
No. Temple Grandin. And she has a really fascinating book about animals. And in the book, she makes the case that once an animal is scared of something, they can never lose that fear. And so she actually makes a really strong Popperian-like statement of impossibility, that once you terrify an animal, they can't unlearn that, because it's kind of stored in their entire physiology, where if like, I think one example she uses is of I think it was a horse that was scared of a black hat. And they something happened when it was young to terrify this horse of a black hat. And they played with it. They tried like a black box. They tried a red hat. Nothing would freak this horse out. But if you showed the horse a black hat, it would just tense up. It would start going into fight or flight mode. And it couldn't lose this. So I think there's like something very deep about what you just said, because I think it spans humans and animals. And I think that it makes sense because our body stores all sorts of information. Like if you have amnesia, if you like lose your memory, you can still remember how to ride a bicycle, because bicycle riding is something which is not stored in our conscious memory, but it's stored like in our body. And like, or even here's a better example, touch typing. Most people can touch type, but I think few people could list off where all the keys are if you ask them to do it on a whiteboard, because that knowledge, that information is stored in your fiber, in your body. And so having a traumatic experience in your past, and you have some like anxiety response, even if you forget the conscious reason that you had that anxiety response, I think the anxiety response can have some permanence, and you can still, your body just tenses up and goes into that mode for certain triggers, which may not even consciously register, but unconsciously they do. So I'm wondering, because you're talking about it as if it's a problem, and I don't know if crying is a problem, unless it's causing you anxiety or unease. But crying itself it's okay.
So let me clarify that, because I think I would be the strongest proponent for crying being extremely healing and extremely necessary.
Awesome.
So,
okay, cool.
So the crying in my worldview is
cathartic.
Oh, definitely. And how I would describe the last 2 years for myself is that I've accumulated and accrued this deep, deep well of unexpressed grief and anger and stuff like that. And it feels like it's real, tangible, inexplicit problem solving when I sob in the right context. It feels like I've literally emptied out a part of this well. And now I feel like I'm at the point where the well is extremely shallow, because I don't know if you have the experience of getting triggered sometimes. You have an extremely overzealous response to something that shouldn't be that big of a deal. And that to me is some kind of indication that you're invoking a lot in that well for something that shouldn't be a big deal. And you can get rid of that. You can completely get rid of that. And I feel like I can't even overstate how much of a different person I am today, if you compare me three years ago, or even longer than that. So I mean, it's I don't know how it sounds so unscientific to say that there's a deep well of grief stored in you somehow, but that's exactly how it feels. Yeah.
Sorry, no, finish your thought.
I'm with a guy called Douglas Tatarin, who has I think it's called bioemotive framework or something. I think that's where I got it. This whole idea how crying is so seminal and so important to get rid of these things. And I combine that with a lot of different things, but that combined with other physical releases and stuff like that, it's just, I don't know if it's for everyone. I don't know if it's a universal thing where everyone is storing emotion. I mean, some people might just be really good at expressing emotion to begin with, and they might not have this, but I think it's more prevalent than people think. And if you are interested, I could share the craziest experience I had with this, which happened like a few days ago. I had, when I was, 19 years old, perhaps, I was on my way to kind of burn out physically for several reasons. So I was already in a bad place physiologically. I was on the edge of fight or flight all the time already. But then I had an experience where I smoked way too much cannabis with my then girlfriend. And people think, oh, cannabis, like that's not a bad thing. Like that, okay, you get a little anxious and paranoid, and then it's over, right? But so we smoked way too much, and I didn't know. I'd never heard of a panic attack. I didn't know what that was, and I was in a very macho, anti-emotional state where I had to be cool, crying wasn't an option at all. And so I had a panic response, and I had a 3-hour long panic attack.
Jesus.
And this is where my theory is. I have no idea how horrible it is to be sexually abused or be in a war or stuff like that. But your body, panic is as bad as it can be. Mm-hmm. And like, you can't get worse than that. So a 3-hour panic attack is horrible no matter what the reason for it is. And so after that, I just, I never talked to anyone. I developed all these physical illnesses. I developed panic disorder and all those things. And so recently I've tried to work with this thing, because my theory is that my body kind of physically, you tense all the stress musculature when that happens. Mm-hmm. And I see it as your nervous system kind of as a string, just tightening mm-hmm. really hard and being on high alert. And I think I never really got out of that again. It didn't go back to normal after that. And so, without saying how I invoked it, I used some tools to invoke this, but I managed to get back into that state without looking for this specific thing.
Sorry, the panic state? You got back to the
panic state? Like I didn't look for this particular.
It just kind of occurred.
Yeah, so that's why I think it's even more interesting and objectively valuable, because I wasn't searching for this particular memory. But so I just got lodged in to, and it sounds ridiculous, but for a full hour, I had like contractions in my stomach where I would dry heave like crazy. And apparently my then girlfriend told me that after this experience, I had thrown up for like 3 hours. I don't remember any of that. And so I started doing that. And then I started screaming, no, help, no. And nonstop. It didn't stop. And I wasn't doing this. Like consciously, speaking of free will, this was not me. This didn't feel like me. Yeah. And then I also would just scream on the top of my lungs. I would scream into like a pillow or something, but it felt good. You know what I mean? It felt right. And
the second time, when you're repeating this experience, it felt good.
Yeah. Like, yeah. So the way I interpret that is this was just waiting, somehow stored in my body for a safe enough environment to be able to actually unload what I wanted to do in that moment 10 years ago. Right. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it was just, after that, I was just, it felt like I had lost 40 pounds.
Can you revisit that emotion, that panic attack, that memory now with greater ease than you could before you approached it the second time? Like, is it easier to think about after this experience?
Absolutely. I don't feel bad about it at all. And I remember I don't like cannabis. I don't like smoking weed or anything like that, but just the smell of it would almost give me a panic attack. So it was just such a powerful physical experience that really cemented to me that it can get stuck in your body. And yeah.
I was going to say, do you guys, maybe inappropriate for the podcast, do you guys experience like a wild relationship between like crying or sadness and your libido? Like for me, like if you're crying or really upset about something, it's like your body is distracted for like, if it, like once, like I had an ex-girlfriend who broke up with me, and like, it was weird. We like only we broke up for like a week or something, and then we got back together. But that week I was so devastated. I'm just like crying all the time. I was like, my body is just like so distracted. And then as soon as that period was over, it was like, it's like my libido had to catch up. It was just insane. So that is my.
I can definitely relate. Yeah.
Nothing makes me hornier than sobbing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's better if you're having sex while you're crying.
Usually it's I'm crying, that she starts crying, and we both just start crying and leave the bedroom in shame. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Well, dude, this was an absolute blast. Thank you so much for coming on.
We're really waiting on you to be like a huge podcast, to get really big, and then we can just ride your coattails into fame. So we're just
thank you both for the kind words.
Growing.
And, it was great to persuade you on free will. Yeah.
All right, dude.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.